Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much indeed for being here. For anybody who doesn't know, I think we already do, I'm Tom Luckhurst. I'm head of the Centre for Journalism at the University of Kent. And tonight's lecture and the presentation which is going to precede it exists to celebrate the memory of Bob Friend, the original face of Sky News. And Bob was an immensely talented reporter and presenter who delivered his work with warmth and a sense of humour that made him hugely popular, and not only in the BBC and Sky newsrooms where he spent so much of his career. His talent was recognised not just throughout the UK, but in Hollywood and in the White House as well. And the Centre for Journalism is very proud to be associated with Bob Friend and to award in his name the Bob Friend Memorial Scholarship. We're also grateful for the partnership with Sky News, which sponsors the scholarship and makes it popular. Before I introduce the 2018 Bob Friend Memorial Scholar and ask Peter Diap from Sky News to present the scholarship, I'd like to welcome some very special guests. Bob's daughters Claire and Lisa and his granddaughter Alice are with us tonight. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Welcome also to my colleagues from the University of Kent's Executive Group, David Nightingale, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, John Whiteman, Dean of Social Sciences. Welcome to Joanne Butcher, the Chief Executive of the National Council for the Training of Journalists, and to all the students of the Centre for Journalism and any of the students from local schools who've joined us tonight. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. Now, our first objective is to award that scholarship. It's the 10th annual Bob Friend Memorial Scholarship, and as those of you who have attended these events before will know, it rewards the scholar with a month-long placement at Sky News, during which they work across television, online and mobile journalism. It pays a cash prize of £3,500, which I'm told comes in very useful these days, and it's a great opportunity for a student to get enormous experience in that work newsroom. Last year's scholar, Emma Ray Woodhouse, who's with us tonight, is a second year student of journalism now. She won her first year. She won't complete her degree until next year. But Emma's already working freelance shifts for Sky News. And my advice is just keep doing that, Emma. Don't let them kick you out and get a job there. Let the end of it. We have several other scholars with us tonight. I know that Sarah Boast, recent scholar, is with us, sitting beside Emma. And I've had the pleasure, Sarah works for a local housing company where she works making their media, but she also does some production shifts for BBC Radio Kent, and I've had the joy in working at BBC Radio Kent being produced by Sarah. She's a very good producer as well, as a very good media officer. Gemma Collins, who won scholarship in 2012 and began her career as a journalist with KMTV, the local television station which the University of Kent and KM Media Group own, is also with us, and I'm very pleased to note that Gemma Resources, the website which Gemma launched and owns, has today been nominated for a prestigious national award by The Guardian. So Gemma, congratulations. It gives me great pleasure to talk about our former scholars, because also with us tonight is Alan McGuinness, who won the scholarship way back in 2009, which makes him sound old, but he's nothing of the sort. But Alan now works as a senior member of the politics team at Sky News, so it's great to have you with us too, Alan. I hope I haven't missed anybody out. The prize, the scholarship, isn't easy to win. Applicants go through quite a grueling process. They have to submit detailed proposals for a story which Sky would really do, and then the shortlisted candidates are invited to the current affairs test before being grilled by a panel consisting of representatives of Sky News and the University of Kent. And this year, 4 students made the shortlist in what was an intensely competitive competition, and I would like very much to recognise the runners-up as well, because they all did brilliantly. They deserve our congratulations. So please applaud for Alex Crean, Isabella Ida Martin, Fraser Norwell. as ever, there can only be one winner, and the panel was unanimous in awarding the 2018 scholarship to a truly exceptional student. The Bob Friend Memorial Scholar this year is Leka Christensen, and Leka's suggestion for coverage of the Parental Bereavement Leave and Pay Bill was thoughtful, sensitive and original. She performed extremely well in front of a tough interviewing panel, and as ever, we made the experience additionally stressful by conducting the interviews in the glass office right in the centre of Sky's Millbank newsroom, so that every journalist in the newsroom could see these students being interrogated and put through their paces. Leka rose to the occasion, and everyone in the centre is confident that she'll go on to great things. I know she'll learn a lot when she goes to Sky News this summer. So, to present Leka with the scholarship, please welcome Peter Diap, Assistant Editor at Sky News, and himself a Kent graduate in American Studies.
So this is my third year of handling this award, and I have to say it was the hardest, and no disrespect to Alan, who I work with a lot. I don't think I expect to see a tougher shortlist, and it was effectively a cigarette paper between some of the candidates that we had to choose. But I'd like to ask Leka to come down and I can present you with the awards, and hopefully look forward to seeing you in the Sky Newsroom in August.
And now, tonight's other main event, the one I expect that you've all been looking forward to, the 2018 Bob Friend Memorial Lecture. I'm delighted to introduce a journalist who's probably already a familiar face to all of you. Amol Rajan is the media editor of the BBC, in which role he's recently undertaken one of the toughest tasks in journalism, reporting controversy concerning his own employer, in this case, the furious dispute over equal pay at the BBC. I think it's fair to say he's done it with calm authority and dignity. In addition to his duties as Hard News, Amol presents the media show and Stock Week on Radio 4. He frequently covers for Jeremy Vine and Simon Mayo on Radio 2, also for Matt Baker on The One Show on BBC One. But despite his prominence as a broadcaster, Amol's not been at the BBC throughout his career. Before his appointment as one of the corporation's frontline editors, he was a newspaper editor. Indeed, he was appointed editor of the independent newspaper at the age of 29 in June 2013. The youngest ever editor of a British broadsheet newspaper. Now, Amol may not remember, but I certainly do, that early in his career at the Independent, he was a meticulous copy editor and commissioning editor on the comment desk, and he occasionally handled columns by a certain Tim Luckhurst. I was very proud to write for that great and much missed newspaper, and Amol stands out in my memory because I hadn't previously encountered such charm, politeness and care for a busy newspaper man. On one occasion, Amol asked me whether I would mind if he cut 15 words from one of my contributions. Such concern was hardly typical in my extensive experience of national newspapers, and I thought he would go far, but perhaps not quite as fast as he has. Since then, and amid all of the other demands on his time, Amol has also managed to write about a book about cricket, one of his great loves. It's called Twirly Men, The Unlikely History of Cricket's Greatest Spin Bowlers. I recommend it to all who care about our most beautiful game. Amol was educated at Gravely School at Downing College, Cambridge, where he read English, and he took his first steps in journalism by contributing to Varsity, the Cambridge student newspaper. It's a great privilege to have him with us this evening. His 2018 Bob Friend Memorial Lecture is entitled The Tortoise and the Hare, or How to Save Journalism from Itself. Ladies and gentlemen, Amol Rajan.
Cheers, Tim. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Tim, for that extremely generous introduction. It's almost as if I wrote it myself, which I partly did. I may have said I was going to cut 15 words, but I probably cut about 30, so sorry about that. And thank you also to all of you for coming. I'm incredibly humbled by the idea of speaking below such a vast picture of myself. This is kind of vaguely Stalinist, so I'm going to try and ignore that that's there. I want to also thank the late, great Bob Friend himself, who I'm sorry to say, deeply sorry to say I never met, though of course I know a huge amount about his reputation, which was immense. I believe very strongly that we have obligations to the dead, not only to respect their memory and honour their contribution to our world, but also, if we can, to continue to try and learn from them, and if we can, to continue the good deeds and works that, were they still with us, they'd be performing. And that's one of my themes for tonight. To be frank with you, that's why I said yes to the invitation to speak here tonight. I really do believe in journalism, as Bob Friend did, and in honouring his memory by discussing tonight's subject in front of a room of potentially great journalists and some genuinely currently great journalists. I hope I can support the principle that journalism is a noble trade, and maybe inspire a few of you to go into it too. But what I want to do in the time that I've got, which I hope is riveting for you, is above all to try and prosecute an argument. To make an argument to you about the nature and future of journalism, which I think deserves hearing. Just before I outline that argument, let me say a lot of journalists give lectures about the future of journalism at the moment. I'm very conscious of that. Aside from this annual event, big lectures have been given recently by people like Lionel Barber, Alan Rusbridger. There's the annual McTaggart Lecture in Edinburgh, the Cudlip Lecture, which is named, of course, for the great Hugh Cudlip, former editor of the Daily Mirror. James Harding, my former boss at BBC News, is giving that next month. Nick Robinson gave the first Steve Hewlett lecture last year. So my challenge, as far as I see it, when Tim Luckhurst got in touch with me, was to try and basically say something mildly original. And that's what I'm going to try and do. And I'm going to try and do that by taking on some of those people, taking on some of their arguments. And my enemy today is conventional wisdom. I think it's good in journalism to have an enemy, even if those enemies are lies. And my enemy is conventional wisdom, or rather conventional wisdoms, and specifically the claim, which many of you will hear all the time, that new technology provides a kind of existential threat to the news business. Now, doubtless it provides a threat, I just don't think it's an existential one. I'm actually going to argue that some of the claims made by journalists about the threats to the news business, for instance, the whole idea of fake news, are in fact not only gross errors of judgment, but a kind of displacement activity, an attempt to distract audiences from the true problems afflicting this trade we call journalism, which are closer to home. British journalists, for the whole of my lifetime as a journalist, have been very good indeed at blaming everyone but themselves. But as Michael Jackson sang in lyrics that you're all going to be familiar with from Freshers Week, no doubt, no message could have been any clearer. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make that change. That's my kind of motif tonight. I'm then going to move on to some actual threats to journalism and also some proposed solutions. Let me start then by attacking what I see as three giant and prevailing myths about the current state, not to say plight, of journalism. Myth one, I'm calling these the phantoms in our midst. Myth one is the idea that Donald Trump is a mortal enemy to the media, and specifically the press. I think that's a myth. I think it's a dangerous myth. My joining the BBC as the corporation's first media editor in late 2016 coincided very closely with the election of Trump, and with it a sudden explosion in concerns about fake news. This was a case of correlation rather than causation, I can assure you. And due to his relentless and ferocious attacks on the mainstream media, his courting of alternative forms of media, and his embrace of conspiracy theorists, Trump very quickly became seen in much of the media as a terrifying foe. This fear was radically accentuated when Sean Spicer, who some of you will know from the various imitations of him on Saturday Night Live, he was the former press secretary to Trump, a very entertaining man. He launched what I call the Spicer Doctrine, and this is the belief that it's a job of government to hold journalists to account rather than the other way around. In a White House press conference early in Trump's presidency, Spicer said, there's been a lot of talk in the... I'm not going to do the accent, rest assured. He said, I mean, I can do if you like, but we'll be here for a long time. There's been a lot of talk in the media about the responsibility to hold Donald Trump accountable, and I'm here to tell you it goes two ways, Spicer said. We're going to hold the press accountable as well. This inversion of the traditional relationship between government and journalism, in which apparently it becomes the task of those in power to scrutinise the scrutinisers, was added to the list of points made by those who said Trump was a mortal threat to journalism. It's important to note that this idea became, for a brief flicker of history, something like a prevailing orthodoxy. There was a real consensus around it. When Trump tweeted a video of him seeming to wrestle a CNN reporter to the ground, not long after insulting that organisation in a very public manner, it became widely accepted that journalists were literally under attack as never before in the history of the modern West. The Committee to Protect Journalists warned of a threat to press freedom. Chris Wallace of Fox News said the president had, and I quote, engaged in the most direct, sustained assault on the free press in our history. Joe Kahn of the New York Times bewailed, and I quote, an American president and his close allies who treat reporters as enemies of the people with no attribution to Stalin or Mao. Yet these arguments, on closer inspection, were the exact opposite of the truth. Donald Trump isn't the enemy of the media, he's its potential saviour. It's largely thanks to Donald Trump that record numbers of people in the English-speaking world are viewing, listening to, or reading the news. And crucially, that record numbers, those record numbers of people who are engaging with the news are also in record numbers now paying for it. All media, left, right, mainstream, alternative, digital, print, have benefited from a Trump bump. In the 3 weeks after his election, the New York Times sold 132,000 digital subscriptions, a tenfold increase on the usual rate. They've been engaged in a truly wonderful, almost nostalgic newspaper war with the Washington Post, whose business model is also humming thanks to Trump. The two papers have been vying to scoop each other with a series of really quite brilliant stories. It's been riveting, and readers have been the winners. Just this month, in fact, the New York Times announced an extra 157,000 digital subscribers for the fourth quarter of last year, with subscription revenues passing $1 billion for the first time. Obviously, that was the result of a team effort, but if, at a push, you had to give credit to one person for this exponential expansion, it wouldn't be Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, it would be Donald Trump. As for television, virtually every American news network is up on its ratings, from Fox to MSNBC, and of course CNN, which had its most watched year ever in 2016. Why? Two words, Donald Trump. And ad-funded, traffic-hungry websites from BuzzFeed to Mail Online to The Independent have found nothing drives traffic like this president. He is, as he often boasts himself, good business. And for obvious reasons. The Trump presidency is not only one of the most astonishing facts of modern history, it's also one of the most astonishing stories, a gift that keeps on giving and giving and giving. Also this month, Twitter, which is essentially, as you know, just a news stream, posted a profit for the first time. There are complex and structural reasons for this, of course, but I know from speaking to them that senior executives at Twitter are delighted, to put it mildly, that President Trump spends his twilight hours on the platform. Every news organisation in the world has been boosted editorially by his remarkable ascent, and unless they're run by complete idiots, each of those organisations has found this presidency to be a commercial boon too. Next time you hear the idea of Trump's war with the media, remember, what you're hearing is a self-serving phrase which is essentially nonsense. This isn't a war, it's a marriage of convenience. Myth 2. Second myth I want to debunk, the second dangerous myth I want to debunk, is the idea that fake news is everywhere. This is a myth, it's a dangerous myth, a self-serving myth. Closely associated with the ascent of Trump is this whole phenomenon of fake news. Of course, when Trump uses that term, he's just referring to news that he doesn't like. The Russia investigation is fake news, the fake news media can't be trusted, and so on. But there is, however, a genuine and relatively new phenomenon which warrants the label fake news. And that is deliberate lies told for political or commercial purposes, transmitted around the world through social media. This material should be distinguished from false news, that is lies and propaganda, that's been circulating in the media for years, for instance through the vile practices of the late sexual predator Max Clifford. Britain's tabloid, I'm glad Tim's laughing. Britain's tabloid newspapers have knowingly been publishing lies for decades, also for commercial gain. Freddie Starr never ate that hamster, as Clifford claimed. For those of you too young or innocent to get that reference, it refers to a famous newspaper front page headline. For those of you too young or innocent to know what a front page headline is, I give up. The recent phenomenon of fake news is different to the ancient phenomenon of false news through its deployment of digital technology. This technology incentivizes massive audiences. The bigger the audience, the more money can be received from selling ads around those fake news stories. And that's the inglorious issue with fake news. Because it's made up, it's sensational. And because it's sensational, people want to share it. Compared to fake news, the truth is boring. It would have been amazing if the Pope or Denzel Washington had backed Trump, but boringly, they didn't. But here's the thing about fake news. Whisper it, but it's not actually that widespread a phenomenon. Yes, foreign actors use bots, as we've been hearing the last week alone, coming out of the Mueller investigation in America. Bots, of course, are those automated bits of software that feign human characteristics, and those bots sow discord and disinformation. But in terms of what we know, fake news accounts are a tiny, tiny fraction of the total amount of information available online. For instance, Facebook has said it thinks the number of fake accounts on its platform are around 3% of the total, and the number of duplicate accounts could be around 10%. Now, depending on how many fake accounts are duplicated, that could add up to a very sizable number, but as a proportion of the overall total, it is, while significant, far from overwhelming. And the company and its community are getting better at discovering and eliminating such fake accounts. What we know about fake news is that it spikes dramatically around big news events. So in a tight election, the use of bots to amplify some messages or sow confusion could certainly make a difference. And Trump's election and the Brexit referendum were tight elections, or tight plebiscites. But as of yet, we do not have anything approaching conclusive evidence that these democratic events were tipped by fake news. So, seen in its proper context, fake news is nothing new, though the capacity for disinformation and lies to reach hundreds of millions of people very quickly is. And I accept that's a recent and worrying development. Similarly, we still know very little about the true extent of fake news, and what we do know suggests it's a small proportion of the total information on the biggest social media platforms. It also spikes around irregular events. Nobody has suggested that the Pope backed Trump for a while, you've noticed. But the principal reason, the main reason, the chief reason to be sceptical, though not dismissive, about fake news is that so many of those who bang on about it have an incentive to inflate the threat. For ambitious politicians, it creates a chance to show themselves to be digitally savvy and deeply concerned about the rise of new technology. For top-ranking politicians, fake news and disinformation online can offer an excuse to cover their own failings. I had the privilege last year of interviewing Hillary Clinton on The One Show, extraordinary human being. She was noble and honest enough to say that blame for her loss to Trump lay principally with her. That was the theme of the book that she was promoting. But it was clear from talking to her, and will be clear to anyone who reads the book, that she put a lot of weight on the claim that fake news was a key factor in his victory. It wasn't. It may have had an influence on some voters, but it wasn't it wasn't Facebook what won it for the president. I sometimes get the impression that even technology companies don't mind talking about fake news because it gives them the opportunity to flaunt their social consciences and even distract from other social obligations, such as paying tax. It's annoying tax, isn't it? But some of you guys don't know about it yet. I tell you, it gets worse. But the people who most relentlessly bang on about fake news are also the people who have the biggest incentive to show they can be trusted. And that is, though I hate the phrase, implying as it does mediocrity, the often loathed mainstream media of which I am a part. Obviously, if you work for the BBC or The Times or Channel 4 News or CNN, when you give coverage to fake news, you hope the audience will see that you are different and that you'll be flattered by comparison. If some news is fake, then presumably some isn't. And we, the aforementioned great media brands, deal in truth. You know, that's the message. Let me repeat that there is a new threat from the viral spread of disinformation online, but its effects are still unclear. False news is far from new, and what we do know about fake news suggests it is limited and spikes around big news events. And the key point is that most of those who talk about fake news have a huge incentive in doing so, in inflating the threat. The third myth that I want to debunk for you today is the idea that people won't pay for news online. Another dangerous, largely self-serving myth. I accept completely that most people under the age of 30 have grown up in a news environment where they expect and are given high-quality news for free. I also accept that a very major reason for this is that in Britain, at least, we have something called the BBC and its website. But what I don't accept is that when these people grow up, when you guys grow up and come to have a bit more money and maybe realise that you need to be well informed to get by, I don't accept that you won't pay for news. Because the fast accumulating evidence points in one direction. If it's good enough, people will pay for content. It's worth saying that around a decade ago, it was absolutely the prevailing view that content online had to be free. The Guardian was perhaps the most militant proponent of this view. Its then editor, Alan Rusbridger, championed open journalism, using that very, very loaded term to imply that when people charged for content, they were part of a closed system, rather than just trying to run a viable business and feed their families. When Rupert Murdoch said he was going to ask people to pay for content, many people said he was mad. His argument was, quality costs. If you want quality, you have to pay for it. And if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. He also argued that readers would pay for journalism if it was good enough. Well, I'm here to tell you that Rupert was right, and those who championed the free model were wrong. Now, thank goodness, people are coming together in their millions to restore the link between top caliber journalism and paying for that journalism. I mentioned the New York Times' recent excellent numbers. Perhaps many of you in this room have a subscription to Spotify or to Netflix, which has built a committed audience of over 100 million subscribers in just a few years, mostly, by the way, using other people's content. Public support for the licence fee of the BBC remains high for now, and look elsewhere too. The Financial Times is approaching 1 million subscribers. If you include digital subscribers, the Times recently overtook the Daily Telegraph. This brings us to a key point. People will pay, but they'll obviously only pay if they place a high value on that journalism, i.e. if it's good enough to justify parting with cash. I used to think that the only way to encourage payment was to specialise. In fact, there was a strong case for believing a few years ago that the future of journalism was specialism. Specialism being a magazine dedicated to fishing, say, or a website dedicated to the hedge fund industry, or a fortnightly satirical magazine like Private Eye, for example, allows you to focus your editorial energies in one domain, target a particular industry, chase advertisers with a unique focus, and distinguish yourself from the great rump of journalism now available online. But it turns out people are willing to pay now, not just for specialism, but for general news too, if it's good enough. For instance, that of the Times. And when the facts change, I change my mind. So I've updated my view. Now I think the future of journalism isn't just specialism, it's also generalism, or general news, which has special qualities and obtains unique standards. This brings me neatly to the question of the economics of the industry, and the first of three major areas of genuine concern for my trade that I would like, with your permission, to briefly discuss. I'm calling this bit the three giants. So far I've addressed what I believe to be three myths about journalism: that Donald Trump is a mortal threat, that fake news is consuming the whole ecosystem in which we live, and that people won't pay for news online. If these are the mythical threats, what are the real ones? I want to split them into three categories: economic, sociological, and editorial. So the economics of news. I hope I've demonstrated there is now clear evidence that people will pay for news, both specialist and general, provided it is good enough. Over the past decade, a toxic combination of scepticism towards this view, groupthink, and sheer myopia has prompted many organisations to conclude that if revenues directly from the audience couldn't be relied upon, it would have to come from advertising. It's extremely important that people in this room realise that there's nothing original about the dependence of news, or news media more broadly, on advertising for a majority of revenues. As recently as the 1990s, which I'm conscious is when many of you were born, august titles such as the Financial Times got some 80% of their income from classified and display advertising, with only 20% coming from reader revenue, or cover price. It's no wonder then that the people running news organisations today, many of whom were just beginning their careers back then, thought it reasonable to rely on digital advertising for income. But relying on advertising online is very often a disastrous strategy. There are two main reasons for this. The first is that it necessarily distorts your editorial values. If you give away your content for free, you become desperate for traffic. And the way to generate traffic is to go relentlessly down market. This temptation has proved too much for many titles. The Independent, which was in print a high-minded title, today has a very different flavour on social media at least. That might, by the way, be the reason it's very, very profitable today. Other websites from BuzzFeed to Mail Online do some very fine journalism, but it's often paid for by clickbait and trash elsewhere on those domains. I know too well how chasing clicks, not least through the tweaking of SEO, distorts editorial priorities. At the end of my first week working on the Independent website, I once had just one article left to publish. I was desperately short of numbers on the traffic front, and it would have spoilt my weekend if I didn't hit my target. Alas, the only piece that I had left to publish was by Andreas Whittam-Smith, the founding editor of the paper. He was a great journalist and, by the way, a very great man, but not a big mover of traffic. And this piece was about the need for greater transparency in the House of Lords and civil service, not the sort of salacious traffic-generating subject that you'd see in the Mail sidebar of shame. Now, desperate for traffic, I looked at what was at the top of Google News, and I saw that One Direction had just released an album in Canada. So I put a headline on Andreas's piece that said, "All the evidence points in one direction. We need reform of our institutions now." It was the most read piece on independent.co.uk that month. I love the idea of all these teenage girls in Canada looking up the latest song by Harry Styles and Zayn Malik and instead coming across an essay by the founder of the Independent on restructuring the Treasury. Suffice to say, tweaking headlines in this fashion ain't what I went into journalism to do. The second reason not to rely on advertising is that in practice it means relying on the likes, and I mean that as a pun, of Mark Zuckerberg. And when it comes to publishers generating traffic via Facebook, it turns out he is a fickle friend. In January, he announced huge changes to Facebook that would prioritise meaningful interactions, i.e. stuff from friends and family over information from news publishers. Already this has had a dramatic impact on the traffic and therefore the bottom line of many publishers. In recent months, BuzzFeed, Mashable and Mike, three websites that are heavily dependent on viral energy for their business models, have either announced layoffs or surprisingly low valuations. Vice Media, I think I read this week in the Financial Times, has missed its revenue targets by about $100 million. All commercial models are dependent, obviously, on external forces and market conditions. But that does not mean it is okay or smart to fund journalism by relying on the algorithms that Zuckerberg and his team tweak on a daily basis. On the contrary, it's much safer to ask readers to pay. If you can get them to do so, you make them, and not the advertisers, your most important customer. You can collect commercially valuable data about them too. And above all, you're liberated from the vicissitudes of social media, whose constant upheaval will never provide a sturdy basis for the top quality work that you want to do, as money direct from your audience will. Media organisations have always been funded by a combination of audience revenue and advertising, but the evidence is abundantly clear and growing in the digital age. You cannot rely on the latter. Not only are Facebook and Google gobbling up ever more digital ad revenue, they are also liable to change on a whim. Luckily, however, the evidence is also abundantly clear and growing that if you provide a service that's good enough and unique enough, readers will pay for digital output. This, of course, means that some platforms will die out. I think the future for many local newspapers, and I'm conscious I speak in a room which has got some very distinguished alumni from local newspapers, I think the future is often unrelentingly grim. Many television channels will become irrelevant or redundant as streaming takes over. The whole process is Darwinian. But that could prompt a new generation of hacks, you guys, to produce ever greater work and take pride rather than feel guilt in asking the audience to fund it. Ah yes, you guys, the new generation. I want to talk now about the demography or the demographics of news. In a moment, I'm going to examine some of the editorial failings of the news industry in recent years, but before I look at why so many journalists have missed the big stories, certainly over the past decade or so, I want to focus on one particular cause of those editorial failings in detail, and that is the that is the composition of the news industry itself. Much of what I'm arguing tonight is, I hope, an antidote to the feeling of crisis that has been the background noise to my own journalistic career. I think for reasons you've just heard, there are plenty of reasons to be hopeful, and some of those supposed threats to journalism are mere phantoms. But I do think there is one reason to panic, one existential threat, one crisis that is engulfing our trade. That is the astonishing and growing disconnect between journalism and the lives of poor people around Britain. Journalism today feels more like the preserve of the moneyed and metropolitan middle classes than ever before. I think the problem has got markedly worse in my time in the business, and I think we need very, very urgent remedies. As I wrote on my BBC blog in December, the most shocking thing I discovered in my first year in broadcasting is the absence of poor people. Regional operations often do it better. They have a genuine connection with local communities in a way that the London headquarters of the BBC, for instance, do not, or does not. But the sector as a whole, in my view, is still dominated by the middle classes. There are many reasons for this, plenty that manifested at the societal level. Indeed, the capture of journalism by the relatively wealthy is a symptom of much deeper ills in our society. My own view is that the most neglected reason for it is that the poor have no lobby in broadcasting. Other disenfranchised groups have highly effective and energised lobbying operations. Those campaigning for greater gender equality and equal pay at the BBC, for instance, have sought and received an audience with the Director General. Champions of ethnic minority representation, including people like Lenny Henry and Simon Albury, the former boss of the Royal Television Society, are effective and well organised. As for regional devolution, the voice of MPs and local politicians from around the country has been heard loud and clear in, for instance, the BBC's expansion into Salford and Channel 4's, the calls for Channel 4 to move out of London. But the poor have no lobby in broadcasting. One reason for this is that they are hard to define. The great sociologists in Britain struggle to define class, knowing there's more to it than economic capital, and that the rapid changes in the nature of work and wages means old language about the working class is no longer valid. You can define being poor or working class through current circumstances, or family, or to some extent even geography. Another reason the poor have no lobby is that being an amorphous group, they are hard to see. If I look at any newsroom in Britain, I can immediately tell you how many people are from an ethnic minority, what the gender split is, and how young or old the place is. What I can't tell you is how many people have a dad who worked in the mines, or a mum who didn't finish school, or who grew up in a council estate, or were on free school meals at a school where less than half of pupils went to university. These two related problems, a lack of easy definition and categorical invisibility, should not, however, be an excuse to ignore the disconnect between journalism and the people it should serve. Lest there be any confusion, let me be clear, I'm not pretending to be some sort of proletarian hero myself. I live in Islington, I went to a good state school, my parents were immigrants who were themselves extraordinarily poor when they grew up, but they simply wouldn't let their sons be wasters. I know what it's like to be skint, believe me, but I'm not anymore. My concern is that the crisis of trust in newspapers and in the broader news media is directly related to the fact that most people feel journalists don't look, sound, think or feel like them in the way they used to. The gradual decline of Britain's tabloid newspapers accentuates this. Of course the tabloids have done some awful, awful things and coarsened our culture, but in their heyday they were tribunes of the poor. The Mirror of my hero, Hugh Cudlip, carried a slogan below its masthead, "Forward with the people." I just can't think of many British media organisations that espouse that philosophy now. Similarly, local papers made journalism a reasonably well-paid trade for those from poorer backgrounds around the country, but no more for the most part. When the Grenfell Tower horror unfolded, there was huge anger among residents about the media coverage. Many of you will be plugged into how that anger went viral. And yes, there were conspiracy theories floating around. I reported from the foot of Grenfell, which even now stands as a disgusting, sickening, ashen monument to human suffering and political and social failure. I have to say that when residents said to me again and again and again and again and again that the media don't speak for them precisely because they don't relate to them and because they don't cover their lives until it's too late and the pictures make good telly, well, I don't think they were completely wrong. I think they were making a case which deserves a hearing. There is a crisis of trust in the news industry and with it a crisis of relevance, and until the sociological makeup of the industry changes to reflect the people we serve, journalism will stagger from failure to failure to failure. This is most urgent and most existential at the BBC, where staff are twice as likely, by the way, to be privately educated as the rest of the population. This failure of representation is, I think, the main reason that, taken as a whole, journalists have missed many, if not all, of the big stories of the past decade. I hope that in what I've done so far, I've made clear that it seems to me journalists have a tendency to blame everyone but themselves. It's President Trump's fault because he's launched an assault on CNN. It's other politicians' fault because they won't come on our shows anymore knowing they can use social media to circumvent pesky journalistic questioning. Relate that to Jeremy Corbyn's interesting use of social media this week. It's other legislators' fault for suggesting new regulation that would cripple a centuries-old commitment to press freedom. It's Mark Zuckerberg and the tech giants' fault because they're taking all our advertising dollars and now not even referring people to our websites. And best of all, it's the audience's fault. They're not paying for quality anymore and they're too distracted by better offers from elsewhere, like watching sport, eating ice cream, or raising families. Well, to this litany of cowardice, this catalogue of doom, this pathetic poltroonery, I say quite simply, enough is enough. Stop blaming everyone else for the failures of modern journalism and take a look in the mirror. Because the evidence suggests that the greatest enemy facing this noble trade is closer to home. The renaissance and renewal in modern journalism that we should all desperately want will only happen when journalists confront and vanquish the enemy within. The fact is, with very few exceptions, the vast majority of journalists have missed most of the big stories of the past decade. Of course, I must include myself in this. We didn't see the financial crash coming. We were taken aback by the 2010 result and the formation of a coalition. We didn't see the nationalist surge in the Scottish referendum, the 2015 Conservative majority, the Corbyn surge in 2017, or, perhaps most remarkably, the actual possibility of Brexit. And of course, like many American journalists, we were shocked by the election of Trump. In terms of my own scorecard, I did better on Brexit and Trump, but I still got the majority of those stories wrong. As I say, there are exceptions to all these cases. The BBC, for instance, did give due weight to the possibility of a Leave win in the Brexit vote. But taken as a whole, the profession of British journalism was caught unawares by almost every single one of those seismic events. To miss one huge story would be perhaps forgivable, two less so. But all of these, in the space of a few short years, I am, as I say, hugely culpable myself. As editor of The Independent, I looked at the 2015 election too much through the prism of a hung parliament that every poll suggested likely, but which didn't accord with the result. So I don't for a minute absolve myself from blame for this, but we have to look at what's going on here and why. Given most of the events I've just referred to are political, and to give some focus to my argument in my concluding remarks, I'm going to suggest where political journalism may have been led astray. And without wanting to make this section of the lecture feel like a stroll through Caveat City, I should say again that when I criticise political coverage, I'm including myself among the guilty men and women, and moreover, there are some truly outstanding political journalists in Britain, many of them my colleagues at the BBC. Now, why might it be that political journalism has been caught so unawares by all these stories? Well, one reason, undoubtedly, is the utter and indefensible tyranny of opinion polls. I cannot emphasise enough to you the extent to which, through the 2010 and 2015 election, the news agenda was hijacked, utterly hijacked, by opinion polls. All of my conversations with very, very, very senior politicians, people who run the country, and leading political journalists, started from a premise set by the opinion polls. And this despite the fact that the opinion polls have been caught with their pants down time and time and time again. I'd really encourage you, if you get a chance, to search on YouTube for Christopher Hitchens' opinion poll racket. There, my hero, the late great polemicist, can be seen more than 25 years ago discussing a cover piece he wrote for Harper's magazine with the headline, "Voting in the Passive Voice, What Polling Has Done to American Democracy." That, he says, is about how the, as he calls it, opinion poll racket has tried to be a substitute for democracy, and how lazy journalists, yes, myself included, use opinion polls, many of them rigged by the way, to generate news instead of going out and finding real news. Opinion polls are a snapshot rather than a forecast, but they give journalists the chance to inject drama and narrative in the often remorseless drift of political life. Broadly speaking, I think political journalism in this country, and I hope some of you go on to be fantastic political journalists who can address these issues, I think political journalism in this country is in danger of being too much Westminster and not enough Whitehall. That is, it's so caught up in the fast sport of party politics, the slow business of government struggles to get a hearing. I made the Whitehall editor, or asked the Whitehall editor of The Independent to write a column called Inside Whitehall to try and address this very problem. There are many journalists who cover policy and government superbly. I think Chris Cook of Newsnight is outstanding, but it's not the norm. There is then the revolving door between journalism and politics. I don't by this mean the great many journalists of all persuasions, including BBC staff, who end up in politics. I mean the tendency of senior political journalists to cross the Rubicon, to become special advisors or directors of communication. You can, of course, understand why this should happen. They have the requisite skills and contacts. And I, for one, do understand the frustration as a journalist, something you are all going to have to contend with, of feeling at times like you're stuck outside, throwing rocks in, rather than inside the room making decisions. But this revolving door just can't help but create the sort of clientism that substitutes propaganda for proper scrutiny. All pack journalism is inherently dangerous. I'm told by some senior political journalists that the fabled lobby, the pack of Westminster journalists, doesn't exist anymore, though I keep seeing evidence to the contrary. And believe me, I've experienced evidence to the contrary in recent years. Pack journalism encourages groupthink and strikes me as belonging to the age before social media. In the Palace of Westminster, it's particularly hard not to be captured by various factions within politics or to go along with what other journalists in the pack, the lobby, have determined to be the news. This means it takes real guts to strike out on your own and say, hang on, everyone else seems to be doing the story, but I don't think it actually amounts to much, and the real story is elsewhere. The demands of rapacious social media, combined with groupthink inherent in all pack journalism, makes covering politics highly prone to what, in my view, are errors of judgment. Let me reiterate, I'm not talking about specific individuals here, but give you a couple of examples. The first is Mogmentum. I'm sure you all know who Jacob Rees-Mogg is. Quiet at the back. Last year, especially through what has become known as silly season in August, there was a burgeoning industry in speculation over whether this idiosyncratic and hugely intelligent and yes, hugely charismatic and effective backbencher was a future leadership contender for the Tories. I read article after article after article after article about how he was the grassroots favourite and various Tories were coming together to plot his takeover lest Theresa May fall. But who does such speculation benefit, other than Jacob Rees-Mogg? And is there actually any substance to the story? It is, of course, one of those self-perpetuating things. Once the story starts to gather, if you excuse the pun, momentum, it does have the effect of inflating Rees-Mogg's reputation, making him seem a more plausible leader. But do ordinary members of the public really care about personalities in politics as much as journalists do? Runners and riders stories always seem to me to reflect the interests of hacks and pundits rather than audiences at home. Or take an example from America. The mad boosterism around Oprah Winfrey is their version of the same thing. After her speech a few weeks ago at the Golden Globes, there was an explosion of chat online about whether she might run for president. Does that mean it should be covered as news? Hell no. But did CNN cover it as news? Hell yes. One of their reports carried the headline, "Sources, Oprah Winfrey, quote, actively thinking about running for president." Where to begin with this? I spend weekday evenings, quote, actively thinking about becoming a reggae producer or eating Nutella straight from the jar. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. The fact that this speculation was coming nearly a year before the midterms of Trump's first term was no barrier to the idle speculation. And if you actually read the story on CNN, it contained sentences such as, and I quote, "One source emphasised that Winfrey has not made up her mind about running." And another sentence, and I quote, "For now, it's all just talk." You don't say. But the piece de résistance came out last July. I was on a stag do in the south of France. Stag do is something that many of you will go on eventually. Don't worry, they're great. Especially when you have kids, you sort of really find you need them. I was on a stag do in the south of France last summer. I don't think it was last June, but last summer, munching croissants and drinking rum sharpeners next to a swimming pool. Suddenly my phone exploded with alerts from news organisations that I follow, including The Telegraph. And what was this remarkable news story that should really be worthy of sending out to all the people that follow you on a particular mobile platform? The story was that Theresa May was saying that she would carry on until 2022. As the Telegraph story put it, the Prime Minister's spokesman said she's no quitter and wouldn't be standing down after Brexit happens in March 2019. A follow-up story, by the way, said that Jacob Rees-Mogg had offered the Prime Minister his support. I have to say, even now, I struggle to contain my anger at this alleged news story. First of all, it's a ridiculous question, because how on earth can she possibly know what the situation is going to be in 2022? I barely know what's going to happen next week, let alone next year. With all the fluctuations in history between last summer and 2022, 4.5 years, the idea that Theresa May can accurately predict her own state of mind in 2022 is ludicrous. The next thing is, what's she supposed to say? If the Prime Minister, or indeed has spoken and said, no, she won't be staying on until 2022 because it's generally felt that she's lost the confidence of her party already, that would have been the much bigger story. So here's some advice for young journalists. If you ask a question to which an honest answer is impossible, don't treat the less than honest answer as a revelation. And finally, there's a simple fact that we just don't seem to learn from history. Through the Brexit campaign, David Cameron said that if Brexit happened, if there was a vote for leave, he would stay on as Prime Minister. He did that because he knew that if he said he would step down, it would change the narrative of the referendum, and, quite understandably, journalists would run with a different story, just as they did when he said, going into the 2015 election, general election, that it would be his last as Prime Minister. So during Brexit, he said he would carry on. After Brexit, he left. That should have taught us that you can't always believe Prime Ministers when they answer this question. And yet still my stag do was interrupted by the frenetic excitement among journalists who thought they'd landed a major scoop. All this speaks to a deep problem within journalism, which is the editorial judgments and interests of those who cover certain professions are often terrible. Amid the endless brilliant coverage, they often miss the real story. Not because they're stupid, but for reasons I've suggested. They subscribe to a pack mentality. They have a quite reasonable impulse towards drama and narrative and conflict. Their interests do not reflect those of most of the public. They're part of a revolving door between journalism and the professions they cover, whether in politics, education, health, or wherever, and that's driven in part by the explosive growth in the PR industry. But there is one reason why all of these tendencies are getting worse. And I turn now to my genuinely concluding remarks, in which I shall propose some solutions to the problems I've outlined. And I want to suggest that the defining qualities of modern journalism also point to a way out of the difficulty that the trade has found itself in. The defining qualities of modern journalism are its scale, its sociability, and its speed. And that is why I want to finish by reintroducing you to the parable of the tortoise and the hare, and introducing you to a new one. And that is the parable of the tortoise and the hare. Forgive my indulgence for a minute, but it's worth saying that I really do believe in the power of parable, and as journalists I think we all should. Another hero of mine, with whom I often disagree, was Isaiah Berlin. He wrote a notorious essay called The Hedgehog and the Fox, about the two kinds of intellectual. Hedgehogs knew mostly about just one thing and saw the world through that prism. Foxes knew about plenty of things and drew on multiple sources and schools of thought. Though Berlin later said he was being mildly ironic with the essay, people always asked him if he was a hedgehog or a fox. The truth is, he was a hedgehog about being a fox. His one big idea was that there was no one big idea. Similarly, I'm sure many of you know the story of the hare and the tortoise, or the tortoise and the hare. This fable by Aesop has many interpretations, few of them as simple as commonly thought, but there is one key lesson summarised to generations of children as slow and steady wins the race. I think modern journalism should be less hare and more tortoise. We are living through, and you guys are inheriting, the Great Acceleration, a period in history in which, thanks to technology, everything is speeding up. Journalism hasn't escaped this revolution. In fact, it has both reflected and contributed to it. But I think the paradox and predicament of our trade is that as the world speeds up, journalism needs to slow down. I still haven't seen the recent film about the Washington Post called simply The Post. I wonder if any of you have seen All the President's Men about Watergate, or Spotlight about the work of the Boston Globe, or Attacking the Devil about the thalidomide scandal that Harry Evans and the Sunday Times so brilliantly exposed. All of these films obviously ooze a sort of irresistible nostalgia, and having grown up on and in newspapers, I enjoyed them. But something about watching them as a newspaper editor, as I then was, hurt me too. And that was the realisation that while I was scrambling relentlessly to get a newspaper out, juggling several full-time jobs, often working 100 hours a week, and trying to manage a digital turnaround on very, very tight budgets, the people doing the journalism that I revered had one fundamental resource that I didn't: time. Did you know that the thalidomide scandal exposed by the Sunday Times, one of the signature newspaper investigations in the English language in the 20th century, unfolded over a decade? All of the great investigations in journalistic history have taken time to land. Even more recently, the Times' brilliant work on alleged sexual harassment at Oxfam emerged from a 10-month courtship of an anxious source by the chief reporter, Sean O'Neill. And yet the advent of 24-hour news and the internet, both of them, by the way, exceptionally recent phenomena when you consider the grand sweep of journalistic history, has created an impulse toward relentless, breathless stories, towards roiling oceans of information, in which, inevitably, poor judgments are made. And all of this is exacerbated and intensified by the social media-driven, dopamine-fueled desire to make stuff go viral. There is nothing wrong with going viral. On the contrary, it's an admirable achievement, provided it's done in the right way for the right reasons. Another hero of mine, George Orwell, wrote in his seminal essay, Why I Write, which all of you should memorize immediately, "My initial concern is to get a hearing. All journalists want to be read, seen, known, and that's completely reasonable. Or at least they want their work to be read, seen, and known, and that's completely reasonable. But the danger is that the pursuit of virality, in other words, clickbait, distorts our editorial values, making us prize being read widely above getting the story right, and getting the right story right. That's why I contrast the Tortoise, who was slow and steady and had a clear sense of his goal, not just with the Hare, whose slapdash and speedy approach was his undoing, but with the share. Because I fear the speed of social media, which allows journalists to reach vast audiences in seconds, is corroding the soul of journalism. Without a recrudescence in the ancient virtues of journalism, digital technology, which ought to elevate us, will enervate and weaken us instead. Obviously, I'm not trying to militate against the journalistic impulse to get a story first, or to be on the scene of a crime or major event before your rivals. Breaking stories and scoops is our lifeblood. We should always want to be first so long as we're right, and the impulse to get fresh top lines on a story and so push it on is a noble one. But for many journalists, being liberated from the need to cover every story as it breaks will free up more time to focus on the stories that actually matter. Clearly, specialist publications such as Private Eye have the huge advantage in being fortnightly and not covering breaking news. But that doesn't stop them breaking news stories. Together with a unique wit, it's the quality of journalism that has driven the magazine to record circulation. Or take the Times. I really think one of the most neglected innovations of recent years is the Times switching to 4 editions a day. As Emma Tucker, the deputy editor, told me on Radio 4's The Media Show last week, that has freed up tremendous resources to focus on big stories because they recognise they just can't compete when it comes to breaking news 24/7. At which point, by the way, I'm not getting paid for this lecture, obviously, but if there were one favour I were to humbly ask of all of you, it's that you immediately, or maybe as soon as I've finished, subscribe to the Media Show podcast. And if you don't think it's a complete waste of space, or in fact, even if you do, you rate and review it. I'd be very, very grateful. Ladies and gentlemen, so far I've given you description aplenty. Let me finish on a positive note by giving you prescription instead. I started by saying I'd finish with some solutions for the undoubted difficulty that journalism faces. Let me cluster them according to the 3 areas of concern: editorial, demographic, and economic. Editorially, British journalism has historically got a huge amount right, and continues to even today. But I think 4 simple steps worth taking immediately include the following. First, a radical shift to context, to the underlying trends and complex ideas behind the news. This is more likely to take place in what you might call the broadsheet end of the market, I'll grant, so be it. I think deep analysis of why events are happening should be considered as worthwhile as descriptions of what is happening. Pockets of British journalism are doing this, of course, but I want to see a mentality in which editors say, what are the 5 or 6 huge stories or huge trends that are going to change how we live? From artificial intelligence and graphene, to the rise of China and the data economy, to people living for much longer. And then for the best reporters to be unleashed on those stories. Secondly, I think a shameless embrace of the principle that it's better to be right and second than first and wrong is long overdue. And a recognition that committing to that principle will sometimes lead you to look slow on the uptake. There is a culture war going on in which the idea of absolute truth has been denigrated. Only by shamelessly fighting for truth can the reputation of journalists and journalism be restored. That's why initiatives like Channel 4's Fact Check or the BBC's Reality Check and other fact-checking services are hugely welcome. They should be given greater prominence. 3, and related to this, I think we need to make immediate and unforgiving statistical correction one of the aims of broadcast journalism. The peerless Mark Damazer, former Radio 4 controller, has suggested having statistical experts on standby after broadcast interviews to check whether claims made on air are correct. Far too often, these checking mechanisms are too slow or arise in places far from the original interview, for instance on websites or social media an hour later. But one of the key reasons for loss of trust in the media is the ludicrous abuse of statistics. If independent arbiters with the authority and expertise of, for instance, the psephologist Professor John Curtis from the University of Strathclyde were on standby, falsehoods could immediately be debunked and trust regained. And 4th, speak for and with the poor rather than to or at them. I know this sounds hopelessly vague, but one of the main reasons for the breakdown in trust between journalism and the public is that captured by middle-class professionals that I mentioned. I take it as a moral duty, being a journalist, to consider myself a tribune for the poor, not because I am a class warrior or proletarian hero, but rather because I know too well how disconnected they feel with our trade, how that rift is widening, and the social consequences of journalism losing touch with millions of people. That means commissioning brilliant programmes, essays, reports, features about the lives of millions of people in poor and provincial Britain and telling their stories in compelling ways that give them a voice and don't patronise them. This would be much more likely, of course, if we change the composition and the demographics of the trade. I've argued that this is one of the most urgent problems we face. It's one so serious that I think we should consider positive discrimination in the best sense of that phrase. I should say at this point, in principle, I'm against positive discrimination. It engenders suspicion and resentment and often demotes merit as a criterion for promotion. But sometimes particular situations are so urgent and so urgently in need of remedy, and the public cost of not acting is so high, that positive discrimination goes from being a bad to a necessary idea. Positive discrimination by class is very, very hard for the reasons I mentioned. Class is hard to describe, and it shifts in a way that, for instance, gender and ethnicity do not. There are also very impressive apprenticeship schemes already in place in many institutions, not least the BBC. But short of quotas, I would consider positive discrimination toward working class journalists from outside of London a valuable option for the BBC when promoting or hiring on and off-air journalists. And though I don't know much about any lobbying organisations within broadcasting set up to help kids from poorer backgrounds, I hope any such efforts can be improved. As finally for the economics, Simon Fox, the Trinity Mirror CEO, Trinity Mirror being a huge regional publisher, told me on the media show last week that there are 2 models in journalism now, scale and specialism. As I've argued, I believe the scale model is inherently vulnerable because it depends on advertising that cannot be relied on, puts publishers at the behest of social media giants, and potentially distorts editorial values. Further to this, there is now exhilarating evidence that if you produce journalism that is unique and of outstanding quality, and you make it easy for them to pay online, they will do so. So if you're not in the fortunate position of being funded by a licence fee, having the balls to charge and take pride in it rather than feeling guilt is often, and increasingly often, the way to go. You know, I'm not part of any generation that experienced the supposed golden age. I missed out on that supposed golden age. Not for me the hot clanging metal and inky glory of the old Fleet Street, nor the public broadcaster awash with cash where you could get paid, you know, the salaries of yore for presenting the news at a time when the salaries of yore went a lot further. I work extremely hard, not because I get paid so much, though I do get paid very well, but rather because I love it. Journalism, in that hackneyed phrase you often find in university prospectuses, is a state of mind rather than a career choice. Technology has made this trade much more sociable and much more partisan, just as it was in the coffee houses of the 18th century where the trade really got going. But it has also made it much more fast. It is absolutely imperative when breaking a story to be first if you can, but scoops, while vital, are not all we do. And as an approach to journalism, the impulse to be fast and to be shared among our friends can too often distract us from the higher calling of our profession, which is to apply scrutiny to power, find truth where it is hidden, and enlighten our culture. Slow and steady wins the race was never meant to sound galvanizing, but it was meant to point to a deeper truth, and truth is our currency. As the sprint of the hare was his undoing, and the dopamine-fueled thrill of the share is ours, so the enduring wisdom of the tortoise should be our inspiration. It's all a matter of time, my friends. Journalism today and tomorrow will be at its best when it relearns the habits inherited from yesterday. That relearning is my task as well as yours, and I commend it to you with all my journalistic experience. Thank you very much indeed. Dada, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, sure. Didn't know if you wanted me to do it from down there. That was really long, wasn't it? Sorry. Is that too long? Sorry, it probably was. Questions. Tim, do you want me to just... Have anyone got any questions? No one's only got...
We'll get a microphone to you. Over there.
If you could say your name, that'd be handy.
Hi, I'm Oscar Rolls. So you've already spoken a lot about the politics and economics of journalism, and it's all very, very enlightening and very interesting. So I think I'm going to frame my question more around the philosophical and ideological slant of what we should be doing as journalists. And I'm sure you're already aware of the ideological conflict and instability that's raging throughout the Western world. In our media organizations, in our social discourse, and in Western universities, such as this fine institution. And it's basically, and I'm vastly oversimplifying here, but it's essentially the far left social justice extremists who are very, very vocal and hold a lot of power, and the far right neo-nationalist fascist in-groups who've risen up to balance the scales in the conflict. And my question to you is, how have you dealt with these two very, very vocal minority groups? And by extension, how should we deal with these groups and remain unbiased in a world where these smaller minority in-groups who have a lot of soft power are growing more and more powerful by the day?
Well, I really enjoy blocking people on Twitter. That's one of the first things. I mean, the toxicity and the polarization of public life right now is a terrifying phenomenon. One of the things that's dangerous, I think, as a journalist is to, because they're so addictive and they're built around gambling technology, which is meant to be addictive, is to spend so much time in social media that it can give you a distorted view of what's actually gone on. It's very, very, very hard for the BBC. You know, I think, I believe it is possible to be impartial, to try genuinely to leave your opinions at the door and trying to get to the truth. But it's very, very hard for the BBC to operate in an atmosphere of social media where and the BBC makes thousands of editorial decisions every day. Everything is subject to the potential to go viral and someone to be annoyed. I think it requires basically intellectual self-confidence. One of the things that's really, really difficult, I'm one of the BBC's on-screen editors. I think there's about 15 of us. Political editor Laura Koonsberg, Kamal Ahmed is the economics editor. One of the things we're paid to do is we're meant to have the experience and judgment to make the big calls. So just as a political editor should be able to stand outside them and does stand outside number 10 and say the Prime Minister's in trouble tonight. So I'm going to make a big call and say, Rupert Murdoch is X, or we don't need to worry about this looming threat from Facebook, or we should be worried about that. And I think it requires real emotional resilience not to be beaten up on Twitter. And not, you saw Mary Beard last week tweeted a picture of herself after she suffered horrific abuse for sending out a tweet. It requires emotional resilience and intellectual self-confidence. And I think that comes from character, it comes from experience, it takes time to sort of develop. But it's really important not to allow yourself to see what's going on social media and think that the world is thinking this. Even when something goes mega, mega viral, it's usually just the 1,000 people you follow on a particular social media platform where that happens. But that's not to sound blasé about the fact that I think now for the BBC it's much, much, much harder to, for instance, cover Brexit, which is an editorial challenge. It's a 2-year negotiation. In a sense, some people would say nothing's actually happening in that time, but there's a lot of lobbying from both sides. It's very, very hard to cover it, and I think the BBC does it really, really well. So, I mean, I'd love to talk to you separately, maybe we can do it over a glass of wine, of what the causes of the ideological divide in the West now are, in terms of how you try and navigate it as a journalist. Intellectual confidence to make the big calls, experience and judgment, emotional resilience on social media, and the joy of pressing block or mute. Yeah. Yep, at the back. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Brad. Brad, sorry.
Brad.
I was very happy to hear you talk about the state of the journalism when it comes to regard to those from poor backgrounds. What I'd like to focus on is that because more poor people are coming to university, because there are more spaces, and that has gone up in previous years, you see a lot of organisations which are looking for candidates where the minimum requirement would be a degree and taking part of an untermed internship, many of which are in London, which, because of rising train fares and obviously the amount of money it costs to live there, it's near on impossible. When you say about how it's important to get poor people into journalism, which I agree with, do you feel like it's more of a societal issue where there are more poor people with high degrees and it's harder for them to get into in the industry in the same way the journalists could back in the day, and with the lower wages, where it's just a societal issue that isn't so easy to solve just by introducing a quota?
I think there is a societal issue about access to certain professions for poor people, and there's a separate question of what do you do as an industry. So on the societal issue, one of the great sociological changes of post-war Britain is the rapid expansion of the higher education sector. So funny enough, I've got a column in today's New Statesman about it, where post-war Britain, we talk an awful lot for good reasons about mass immigration, which has changed Britain. We don't talk so much about mass education. In the 1960s, about 200,000 people went to university. It's now closer to 2 million. And so when you have this rapid growth in the number of people who are graduates, you get some pretty profound social changes. One of those, by the way, is the curious phenomenon of momentum, which is I don't know if anyone here is a member of Momentum, but Momentum is a graduate populist movement. Populism, this is a part of the answer to your question, populism is the practice of setting the people against the elites and presuming that the people have a single will and have been betrayed by the elites. And one of the consequences of the rapid expansion of the university sector is that we've now created this huge number of graduates who, like you guys, are unable to get jobs, unable to get houses, and are really struggling. And I think Momentum is the expression of that. So there is a wider societal issue about expanding the university sector and access to good careers, and the fact that being in your 20s is harder than it used to be because of your skin. Just to put some flesh on the bones of that, I spent my first 6 months after university without a job. It racked up an awful lot of debt. It was a very, very uncomfortable experience. I lived in not particularly nice circumstances. My first proper job outside of university was, or after university, was on The Right Stuff on Channel 5. I don't know if any of you guys watched that, but I used to be the mic boy in the audience that went around with a funny headset and talked to people about whatever it was. I got paid £866 a month after tax, of which 550 went on rent. So I lived on the difference, which is about 300 quid over a month and a bit. So about 75 quid a week. And I was one of the lucky ones, and that was tough. And I used to drink a lot, so that was really hard. You do less of that when you become a parent. This is off the record, isn't it? No. Shit, it's not. So I say that not to be self-indulgent, but just to give you a sense that lots of people go through a time when they're struggling to get by. To be completely frank, I think journalism has become more and more of a graduate profession. I think the collapse of tabloid newspapers have accentuated that. And I'm not going to pretend it's going to be easy. I think the worst thing I could do is come up here and patronise you or lie to you. I think if you want a job in journalism after you finish this course, London is where most of the jobs are. Luckily, things are across the board improving. But yeah, you might spend some time living on your mate's sofa, racking up quite a lot of debt, And generally speaking, the trick is to get your foot through the door, get work experience, and then just not leave, as Tim says, you know, which is how, for instance, Oliver Duff, who's now the editor of the I newspaper and the youngest editor of a national paper in Britain, that's how he got in. He got work experience at the Independent. He 2 weeks photocopying, 7 weeks later he was still there. He was incredibly bright, incredibly nice, incredibly effective, really good journalist. They said, well, we ought to start paying you. 10 years later, he's the editor of the I. So there is I'm sorry to say that you guys, and I feel very, very old. I'm 34. I'm part of a generation that missed out on the golden age. You guys have been shafted. You've been shafted by baby boomers who have basically created circumstances for you in which you're unlikely to have as soon as you graduate. You've got other benefits, many, many other benefits. You get iPhones, which baby boomers didn't have when they were your age, but you are inheriting a difficult situation. And it would be patronising gibberish for me to say that you're not going to possibly have to face 6 months, a year, however long, struggling to get by. And that if you're poor, that's obviously extra painful. There are lots and lots and lots of great schemes to get people into the BBC and elsewhere, but I think the trick is to do whatever is necessary to get yourself legally through a door and then not leave. And obviously, the way to get a job as a journalist is to be unbelievably brilliant. It's very simple. It's genuinely very, very simple. It's probably true of management consultancy and being in a hedge fund, but if you are unbelievably, utterly brilliant, if I was employing you, I used to run a newspaper where a lot of people would come in who are on work experience. If I employed you, you came in, you said, my name's Brad, here's a fantastic scoop you can put on page 1 tomorrow, I'd think, maybe I should pay that guy and stop him going to work for a rival. So get in and then be irresistibly brilliant. And the irresistibly brilliant bit and the getting in is actually up to you. Next.
If I can hold the mic for 2 seconds more. You said something really interesting earlier on, and it might have just been a passing comment, but you said that people are happy to pay a license fee for now. And with the recent acquisition of the Express newspapers by Trinity Mirror and the trying to acquire whether everyone tried to get Sky News, we have seen these massive organisations dominate news. Yeah. And with that comes a lot of power, and it's not new information that a lot of news organisations doesn't like the BBC. Do you see that changing soon? The antipathy from news organisations towards the BBC, I don't think will change. I think it's always been there and is there now and will continue to be. What I was referring to with that comment is that I think that the BBC faces a number of genuine existential challenges, which are mostly to do with technology and streaming. How many people here watch linear TV? How many people here watch programmes because they're on at a particular time? You guys probably stream. I watch everything streamed. I watch everything through the iPlayer. And the BBC has to fundamentally shift to mobile technology, to streaming, and is currently built around, the BBC is incredibly vast, I don't want to simplify it, but it's built to some extent around linear TV and channels. And there is a massive, massive, massive crisis of young audiences watching BBC content where the resources are put into. So for instance, the 10 o'clock news and 6 o'clock news, which I work on, are two of the biggest and best TV bulletins anywhere in the world. They're fantastic, really first-class journalism gets on there, except when I'm on. And they get an awful lot of money. The average age is probably over 50, 55. The average age of the Andrew Marr show audience, and Andrew Marr is a world-class broadcaster, absolutely fantastic, gets the Prime Minister on, interviews him brilliantly. I think, I would guess 2/3 of his audience are over 55. So when I meant the existential challenges, we need, as a BBC, and I'm speaking as an individual, I'm not a corporate representative of the BBC, and I don't want to be, but the BBC's got a massive problem with getting to young people, and the next licence fee settlement is in 10 years' time. The BBC's only going to get that if there's political and public support for it. It's only going to get that if it's an absolutely integral part of your lives, which means that it needs to shift its technological operations to be where you are, which is on the social media channels and mobile platforms that you are. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Why don't we go there, because there's nearby two. Go at the back first, maybe. Tell us your name.
Hello, my name's Max. First of all, thanks a lot for coming out tonight.
Pleasure.
So, the question I'd like to ask is, in today's age of, internet search basically modifying itself for your preferences, like on Google and Facebook and things like that, where this engines will actively direct you to things that you've previously searched for, like things that are very similar. I've seen this sort of trend where people sort of get rammed into their own sort of groups, where those who believe a certain way sort of live together in perpetuity, and they never really interact with those on other sides. Like you have people, like if we've seen the clashes with Antifa and people in America, where these ideologies live separately and think more, like talk more about each other than to each other, which leads to people, like if you speak to them, they think the other side is completely evil and has no redeeming qualities, but then when they actually meet, you know, there's obviously common ground and stuff. What would you say is the best way to sort of break through this division that, you know, technology and sort of human nature in itself has sort of created?
I think you point to one of the most dangerous social phenomena of our time, which all of the economic incentives around social media are geared towards making social media a stickier and stickier experience, because that's how you sell advertising off it. And people tend to have sticky experiences by being in the presence of people they know and like and agree with. So there's a real massive problem. There's this astonishing development in the last few months of very senior, or formerly very senior executives at big technology companies like Facebook, Google. There's one particular guy called Sean Parker, who was the founder of Napster, played by Justin Timberlake in the film The Social Network, coming out and saying that they're really worried about what they've created. I think the boss of Apple said, which was a remarkable thing for him to say, that he doesn't let his, actually I should check this because I don't want to libel him, but I'll say it anyway. He doesn't let his children use smartphones at particular times, or an iPad at particular times, because it can be so addictive, and he's worried about the impact of screen time. It's a real problem. I think it would be dishonest to suggest, and disingenuous to suggest I've got a solution. My own particular thing that I try and do, I mean, social media is obviously where I spend a lot of my life, and I think it's been a benefit to democracy in the round. One thing is to try and limit the amount of time I spend on it, so to not be reaching over at 2 in the morning, kind of, you know, when I'm trying to feed my son because he's being annoying, although I love him very much. Not looking at social media at those particular times. I try very hard to create zones in my day where you're kind of, you know, talking to human beings, and I try very hard on particular platforms, so through YouTube, through what I watch, and through Twitter, to follow people that I either disagree with or who just a range of opinion. I don't know how you guys do it, but Facebook for me is mostly has been a non-professional thing. It is just now a stream of baby pictures and you know, people, mates of mine, sort of thing. So trying to use social media for particular reasons, trying to be enlightened by a diversity of opinion, and trying to celebrate intellectual plurality is the kind of the way to do it. But none of that really cuts through the economics of social media, which is to incentivize often echo chambers and narrower experiences. And even as I talk, I feel unbelievably depressed about the future of humanity as a result. In front of you, yeah.
Hi there, thank you very much for your talk. Well, first of all, I'm Amol Rajan, I study sport and exercise science at the University of Kent, and but I'm aspiring to be a sports journalist myself one day. That's why I'm very passionate about journalism as well. Sean Hare from Fox News, if you heard him, he said a year ago that journalism is dead, and the reason why he stated that, first of all I disagree with him, the reason why he stated that is because he knows that other news networks, especially in America, they have like a hidden bias towards of their political agenda or their agenda or different agendas itself. And I'm worried about this country as well. Do you believe that this country has an agenda, and is that what like different news organisations have a certain political agenda? And if so, do you think that could be addressed at some point so the public are reassured they're getting fair information? Because with regards to Brexit and recent elections like 2010, 2015 that year alluded to, that was a conversation that I was hearing as well back where I'm from. Is the media reporting fair news from both left, right, centre, whoever? But do you believe that is an issue, and if so, do you believe that could be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, it's so a couple of things. One is Sean Hannity, it's interesting he says journalism is dead. I'd give greater weight to that if I considered him to be a journalist. And he's not in any conventional sense a journalist anymore. He's a, by the way, an extraordinarily effective and brilliant communicator. Whatever you think of his politics, he's a commentator, propagandist, polemicist, conspiracy theorist at times. So he's not, I think we should be reassured that there are other people who believe in journalism who disagree with him. On the kind of political divide, I think most people, when I was growing up in the 1990s, there was a sort of very common phrase about, you don't believe all you read. I think people are pretty attuned to the fact they're going to get distorted nonsense from the tabloid press. I think they sort of expect it and they take it with a pinch of salt. I think you'd have to be, there are clearly lots of naive people that believe everything they read in various newspapers. I think people are aware of that. I guess the nub of your question, as I understand it, is do people still think it's possible that they could get a fair news service from anywhere? And in this country we have this unique institution funded by basically a tax, a public broadcaster, which is very different to a state broadcaster. A state broadcaster serves government, public broadcaster serves the public and people. And that's the BBC. And I actually genuinely think the BBC can do fair, straight news, and I think there is an appetite for it, and I think that the need for it is dramatically increased in a world of disinformation and fake news, however big a problem fake news is or isn't. So I think it does exist. I think people do want it. I think the need for it has grown because of the wider information sort of ecosystem, but I think that wider information ecosystem has also made it very, very much harder. I think the BBC's always felt, I've only been there 16 months, but the BBC's always felt kind of attacked from all sides for various things. I think it's under unprecedented scrutiny because of social media, and it's still the most trusted. People generally think it's impartial, but those things are being eroded, chipped away, and it's going to be hard. It's much easier to lose that trust than it is to gain it. It takes a long time to gain it. It can go very, very quickly, accentuated by scandals like the stuff over Jimmy Savile. So I don't think that we're going to move to a situation, if that is I don't think it was the implication of your question, but I don't think we're going to move to a situation where more news is generally trustworthy and reliable. I think people know that what they get from some parts of the press and what they certainly get from some parts of the online world is bollocks. I think they know that, and I think that they're very aware of it. That strengthens the case of the BBC, and I personally hope, whether I work there or not, that the BBC is able to persuade people there is such a thing as fair and impartial news, and it does it well.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Gentlemen here? Then I've bored you all to death and you can all go and get pissed off.
Hey there.
What's your name?
Joe.
Hi, Joe.
I love the focus on the roles in social media from editorial stance, but I was just wondering what you think about the importance for citizen journalism, whether you think there's going to be a rise in importance, potential dangers. Do you think it has a place in modern journalism, or do you think it should be something more shunned out by professionals?
I think I remember being at the Independent during the Arab Spring and what was going on in Tahrir Square in Cairo. And the thing about what was going on in the Arab Spring is it was literally like this viral kind of uprising across this part of the world, where there's been brutality and repression for a long time, is a lot of that now. And it's just quite hard to predict the news. News happens in places that you don't know. And the thing about iPhones, or smartphones I should say, is they've made everyone a journalist, they've made everyone a publisher, they've made everyone a news gatherer. And there is something absolutely irresistible about having pictures or images or news first. I mean, it's the first three letters of the word news. It's that impulse to be first. And citizen journalists, because of digital technology, will be able to get first. And to the extent that the appetite for information grows, and the internet is this bottomless pit, this kind of infinitely hungry beast, to the extent that there is a growing appetite for information, there'll be a growing appetite for people that get to the story first. And in an increasing number of places, because the world is what it is, that won't be journalists who are paid professionals, it will be citizen journalists. I think that the role of people at established media, who a lot of whom have been absolutely terrified by this, by the way. They think, I've spent 20 years looking at health policy. Now some numpty can set up a blog called healthpolicy.com, and they get more clicks than I do. I think the role for established journalists is to be extraordinarily cautious with what you use. So you verify it, you check it, you are transparent about the fact that you didn't get it yourself. And that's a kind of mature way of using citizen journalism, but also to still work out what you can do that others can't. I don't know about you, but I still, if there's a bomb that goes off in some part of, if there's a shooting in America, which unfortunately there seems to be on a sickeningly regular basis, if someone in the school has got incredible footage of what happened, a citizen journalist, that's going to go viral, and I will watch that. But I still think there's absolutely a place for the journalist who arrives later on, who's a trusted person, who's an authority on these subjects, or the expert on issues around gun control, or the commentator from the NRA who says what we need to do is make sure everyone's got guns and that way no one will die, or whatever it might be. There's still a place for that stuff. So I think citizen journalism is an extraordinarily exciting way of getting more amazing pictures and stories and news, but it has to be treated with caution and be part of the overall mix, and I don't think needs to be an existential threat to established journalists.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Anyone else? Over there? Ooh, gentleman at the front, from our friend from Sky, Pete, and then lady at the back, and then Tim's going to tell me to shut up after that. No? We can carry on all night. We should all get drinks, and that way we can carry on.
From Sky News.
Hi, Peter.
Something that came up in the interviews with Bob Friend's scholarship was this concern that you voiced about the class diversity in journalism. And I wondered, given that you're a middle class professional who lives in Islington,
yeah,
how you counter that in your daily life, what steps do you take to connect with the poor, and what recommendations would you say to the journalists, budding journalists here, to make sure that they also connect with people from different walks of life?
So, my personal life, one small thing is I'm setting up I'm grateful for all help, by the way. I'm setting up a charity for kids from state schools in London. It's called the Key Sessions. It's a week-long summer academy. I've got the funding, I've got the schools, I've got the venue, and the idea is that you do inspirational talks for kids in a classroom of 25. So it's TED Talks for teenagers, it's practical advice for kids from poor backgrounds who think being a lawyer is about putting a wig on and going to court rather than dealing with Spotify or Netflix, and it's also mentoring. So I spend a huge amount of time doing that sort of thing. I quite separately am patron of a charity which I was previously trustee for and a street worker for in Islington called Prospects, that deals with kids in terrible circumstances involved in gang and knife crime. So I've had a lot of exposure to kids from poor backgrounds and dealing with lots of difficult things. So I feel personally like I know a bit more about their world than a lot of other people in journalism. I'm not pretending to be extremely poor myself. The other thing is a kind of healthy skepticism. I think you just have to try and be normal enough to know that when people are obsessing about kale and quinoa and nonsense that I like kale and quinoa, it's great. I used to be a restaurant critic, but I think a healthy skepticism towards the interests of metropolitan middle class people is just something you have to keep active and at the forefront of your mind. In terms of the measures that journalists can take, the most interesting, all stories come from people, and the most interesting stories come from surprising people. And I think that if you were a journalist, the ways to get a story, you could just barge your way into a boardroom. It's quite an interesting thing to do. But you could also barge your way into a poor community. And I think actively seeking stories in a non-patronising way, and using, I think it was Max's phrase about, or was it Andrew's, about speaking to poor people, is a way of doing journalism about and with and for poor people, is a way of just ensuring you're reflecting their priorities. That's a really straightforward thing. I have an idea, for instance, this is a way of putting some practical meat on the bones of what I'm saying. I have an idea about doing a story from 3 different coastal towns around Britain. You're probably going to nick this for Sky, aren't you? believe very strongly, and actually got the idea for this from a magazine piece published in the FT last year, that one of the great tales of our time is deglobalization, industrial collapse in places that were previously full of thriving communities. And I think one way of trying to humanize that is to talk about the mental health crisis in coastal towns. Places like Great Yarmouth in East Anglia, places like Blackpool, places like, well, in Falmouth in the southwest. And I have an idea of going to the end of the pier in these various places and trying to interview people about their use of antidepressants, male suicide rates, which are very, very high, and trying to humanise the story of deindustrialisation. That's just an editorial idea about the lives of poor people. I think you can meet with a very immediate objection, which is, well, this is just misery porn. This is just, saying that poor people have crap lives. But trying to do journalism about people from backgrounds different to yourself is the best way of correcting that, and hiring people from different backgrounds is, I think, the best way of correcting the monopolisation of the media by metropolitan people. Is there someone at the back? Sorry, there was one person at the back. Okay, if any of you want to leave, I feel very, very bad. I feel very, very bad for retaining your presence. There's a lady at the back, second in. That's fine. What's your name?
Hello.
Hi, Rachel.
I'm Rachel. I'm in my 3rd year at CSJ.
And you want a job?
Yeah, well, sort of.
I'll see you later. I'm not doing.
Well, that's sort of what I was going to say, but so I've been looking at jobs recently, and you were saying that quite a lot of people in the BBC are privately educated, and I'm sure quite a few people here have not been privately educated, and I'm a girl. So how much of a disadvantage am I at when going into the working world and looking at places like BBC, maybe Sky News?
In terms of getting a job at the BBC, I don't think you're at a disadvantage for being a girl. I don't think that's an issue. The BBC's had and has failed on some specific instances of equal pay. There's a broader issue. Equal pay is about the legal obligation to be paid the same for the equal work, despite regardless of your gender. There's a separate issue, which is the gender pay gap in an organisation. How much are the men getting paid? What's the difference between that and the women? And the BBC's gender pay gap is 9%, which is a bit better than the average nationally, which is 18%. So there is a gender pay gap across the whole of the media and lots of industries. I think the BBC is a bit better than, is better than the national average. So I don't think gender is going to be an inhibition specifically, and I don't think not going to a private school is going to be inhibitor in any way. The BBC, what I was referring to is the fact that I think about 15% of BBC staff, I'm told, privately educated, which is a bit more than 7% of the national population. So neither of those things are going to hold you back in the slightest.
Great.
Any other questions, finally? Any other questions?
I was going to ask you, what about the gender pay gap?
What about the gender... Sorry, hang on a second.
Hi, I'm Ron. I'm in my 8th year at the Centre for Journalism. Tim mentioned it in the introduction. When you were covering the BBC pay gap, gender row, were you put under any intimidation, or did you have complete freedom to cover it the way you wanted to?
Oh, thank goodness you asked that, because I thought you were going to ask me for my views, and I've got to stay resolutely neutral on this, because I'm the poor bugger they've chosen to cover it. Yeah, so something that is really, really, really cool is I haven't had a single sliver of a whiff of a sniff of a tenth of a conversation from anyone senior who put any pressure on me to say anything. And I've done some stories that people at the BBC were embarrassed by, which I got from other senior BBC people, and no one said, don't do that. And I think that's really cool. I think that's really cool. And I think that Sarah Sands, who's the editor of the Today programme, wrote a diary in the New Statesman where she talked about the fact that Carrie Gracie, who was the BBC's China editor and resigned that post over the fact that she was underpaid for her job for several years, she criticised the BBC openly, and regardless of whether she was right to or not, which I don't take a view on, the fact that you could do that at the BBC says something good about the resilience and strength of the BBC. I think I know there's an awful lot of people, an awful lot of newspapers where if someone said something that went against the it was that critical. If an employee said something that critical of the organisation, they'd be out before you could say, my name's whatever. And I think the BBC, in that respect, is to be applauded. But no, I didn't come under any pressure whatsoever. And actually, now you mention it, I think that's pretty cool.
I'm going to arbitrarily call them to work.
Thank goodness for that.
I want to do two things. One is to thank Amol for an extraordinarily erudite, profoundly thoughtful, and I think genuinely immensely generous lecture. It's the 10th annual Oprah Memorial Lecture, and I don't think I've ever heard quite as much thought, preparation, and real insight. I know you can put this on the BBC website. I think it'll make ammunition for about 9 seminars, so we'll be talking about this for several months to come.
Very
so
kind.
First of all, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, gentlemen.
Pleasure. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much.
I'm going to ask Amol to hang around and do some photographs afterwards, but I want to just close.
Have a drink more like.
Do it, yeah, both, drink and photographs.
Excellent. I'll be delighted.
Definitely. The other thing I want to do is to remember that we're here to celebrate a 10th. 9th, sorry, forgive me.
Is it the 9th?
Is it really?
What first rule of journalism is you have to be able to count.
Well, politics important. I think you're wrong here, and I think it's 10. I'll discuss that in the office. 2009 to 2010. But we'll discuss that. Okay. What I also want to do is to remember that this is about Lair's victory in 2018 Moffred Scholarship. So we also give a huge round of applause. Thank you all very much for coming. It's great to have such a good turnout. We've been really privileged to hear a fantastic lecture tonight. Thank you again. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, guys.